You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Two familiar Republican names from last year's election are back in the news: Kent and Pete Serrano. They're not running for election, but they may be finding success instead with federal appointments. Kent is a former Green Beret who ran unsuccessfully for the U.S. House twice in District 3. The Senate approved his appointment as director of the National Counterterrorism Center late last month. Serrano was the mayor of Pasco and ran for Washington Attorney General against Nick Brown. It was reported late last week that he is the presumptive pick to take over as U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington. For many candidates who lost statewide office, a failed campaign is the end of the line. So how have these GOP candidates from a deep blue state been able to give new life to their political careers? Here to talk about it is Seattle Times senior political reporter Jim Brunner. Hey, Jim, thanks for being here.
Hello.
So let's start with Kent. He ran a couple times for the 3rd District House seat in Southwest Washington. How did that go? And what is his background that, led him to this counterterrorism job?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you mentioned he's a former Green Beret, decorated combat veteran, and he ran for Congress first in 2022. If you remember back then, Representative Jamie Herrera Butler held a seat, a Republican. She voted to impeach Trump. She was one of 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump. Trump wanted revenge. Kent is a very sort of loyal MAGA soldier, very admiring of Donald Trump and his agenda. So he ran as part of kind of that revenge campaign and ousted Herrera Butler in the primary. But when it flipped to the general election, you had this Democrat, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, then virtually unknown, who got in.
Auto shop, co-owner,
with her husband. And she beat Kent. And the rap on Kent basically is that was a winnable, even Republican district that votes for Donald Trump. But there were a number of Republicans and independents who said, I can't vote for this guy because of many controversial statements that he's made about January 6th attacks, about Dr. Anthony Fauci, and, kind of the embrace of quite a few conspiracy theories.
So he lost that initial race and then lost again to Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez by a bigger margin. I will say on the subject of conspiracy theories, he came on my show really soon after the assassination attempt on President Trump, and he was espousing and supporting this idea that the Secret Service had something to do with the attempt. And this was very early on, right after the attempt. And I asked him, is this responsible to be talking about, what amounts to a conspiracy theory? And he is somebody who goes hard on these issues. He appears on conservative media a lot. He's a real pugilistic kind of guy, especially when you have a camera on him. And he didn't back down. So when you think about the ways that he caught the attention of the Trump administration, that might be, part of it.
Yeah. He was a very frequent guest on Steve Bannon's War Room, so that gives you an idea of his sort of media diet and environment that he's actually comfortable in. Although he's done interviews with all kinds of mainstream outlets. He talked to you. He talked to pretty much anyone.
To his credit, he came on NPR. Yeah. Sure.
He came to the Trump administration's attention, not just because of that, but because, there was kind of a personal connection between Donald Trump and Kent. Kent's wife was killed. She was a Navy cryptologist. She was working, doing counterterror operations. She was killed in Syria, I believe it was 2019. And when her body was taken back to the United States, President Trump then was there, met Kent, was very impressed with him. Obviously, Kent was, I'm sure, grateful to Trump at the time for being there. And so they kind of hit it off then. And, the rest is sort of what followed from that. I think Trump and his people encouraged Joe to run, for Congress against Jamie Herrera Butler.
So at first he was working for Tulsi Gabbard. He was a acting chief of staff for Tulsi Gabbard at the director of national intelligence. Now the role is what? What is he going to go on to do at this counterterrorism center?
Yeah, I think those two sort of positions are pretty related. They've clearly been working together closely. I believe, Joe has always been a supporter of Tulsi Gabbard, and she supported him. And when he came up for his confirmation hearing, for example, one thing that caught my eye is he said that the intelligence officials were already investigating under the new Trump administration whether sort of the national security apparatus or the FBI had any role in instigating the January 6 attacks. In other words, it's this idea that it wasn't a bunch of angry Trump supporters, but it was a secret plot by the FBI to maybe entrap them. Now, at times he's dialed that back a little bit and said, well, maybe they didn't like set up the whole thing. Some of it was real, but they may have been in the crowd and escalated the violence. So now you have a guy who has those theories and has said, that in the past that he didn't think that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, for example, to Joe Biden, which was the Stop the Steal movement that led to the January 6 attack. Now he's in a position where he is participating in presumably these investigations. He's knowledgeable of them. And so the National Counterterrorism Center acts as sort of a clearinghouse. They have a database of, it's like a terror watch list, basically. They work with a lot of different law enforcement agencies, including the national ones, the FBI, the CIA. And also during his confirmation hearing, Joe Kent said that he's aligned with the Trump administration's efforts to tie drug cartels to terrorism, sort of designate them as a terrorist threat and use the apparatus of the federal government to go after them in a new or more aggressive way.
Yeah, there was reporting by the New York Times that he had gone and asked for an analyst to rework intelligence about Venezuelan gangs and the Venezuelan government in order to, this is the reporting from the Times, to more closely align with the justification that Trump was using to deport especially Venezuelan immigrants to the CCOT prison in El Salvador. So that was kind of like asking an analyst to go back to the intelligence and rework it. And the analyst thought that this was in order to match a political goal for the Trump administration. So something that, we've seen already, from Joe Kent when he's been in these positions. I want to ask about the opposition from our local senators. Senator Patty Murray, Senator Maria Cantwell, both opposed Kent's nomination. What did they say?
Yeah, Senator Murray in particular was very vocal about this and gave a speech on the Senate floor and said, look, she brought up Joe Kent's, we haven't mentioned this, but he was also involved early on even before being confirmed, in this so-called sort of Signalgate scandal where...
Yes, he was on the group chat.
He was on the group
chat
with Pete Hegseth and I think J.D. Vance and others, and they were discussing a pending attack, military strike against the Houthi rebels or group. And, some of them were giving sort of operational information in advance. Oh, we're going to, here's what we're going to do. Joe Kent didn't actually type that kind of stuff, but he was on the group chat. And of course it became public because somebody added a journalist, the editor of the Atlantic magazine. And so he was, caught up in the news in that. So Patty Murray mentioned that and said, he's part of this Trump administration group that's just not qualified to manage national security. And she also very forcefully brought up what he has said about the January 6th attacks and said, look, if you can't correctly identify the cause of the January 6th attacks, I really question your judgment. And it's just bottom line. How are you out there defending the country and defending democracy if you can't get that right?
Moving to Pete Serrano, we've got a couple of examples of this, Republicans who lost elected office in Washington and then getting these nods from the federal government. Pete Serrano is the president's pick, reportedly, for U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington. He was the mayor of Pasco, ran against Nick Brown, lost pretty decidedly. What do you make of this pick? Jim, what stands out to you about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure the nomination has formally been put forward, but he clearly seems to be the pick. Pete Serrano has run a group called the Silent Majority Foundation for a while. He's an attorney. They filed a lot of lawsuits. I think they challenged some of the vaccine firings in state government, for example. They've challenged some other policies, basically, of the Democratic administrations in Washington state. These lawsuits have been, that I've seen, have been largely unsuccessful, but some of them are on appeal,
When you see these reports of Serrano being in line for this appointment, what does it tell you about the ways that the Trump administration is approaching Justice Department picks, especially as opposed to the first term?
Yeah, I think throughout the second Trump administration, you've seen a real emphasis on definite loyalists, definite people who are on board with the entire agenda, and in particular on things like immigration, I also feel like there's a real thread of using the power of the federal government to crack down on blue areas that are perceived as not taking care of homelessness or certain crime. You saw Trump just today saying we're going to federalize the Washington, D.C. police force and send in the National Guard there. Washington, D.C. is a little bit of its own situation, but I'm really curious to see how that plays out here. In Western Washington, they have not announced the pick for U.S. attorney. There's an interim. And that's where it'll be really interesting because you have, the Trump administration and Republican politicians even in Washington state saying, Seattle basically needs to be trod upon and, or reined in or controlled somehow.
Like the local law enforcement, local leadership is not doing its job. And so somebody needs to step in.
So I'm curious to see who the pick will be for that. And in a contrast, in the first Trump administration, the pick for the Western Washington U.S. attorney was Brian Moran, who was a Republican, who had been, served as chief of staff to Rob McKenna when Rob McKenna was attorney general. But he was perceived as a pretty mainstream pick. I think he got pretty bipartisan support. I would kind of predict possibly a different kind of pick this time, but we'll have to see who actually gets named.
Both Pete Serrano and Joe Kent are Republicans who were too conservative for Washington state, for this deep blue state. But they were known to be fighters here. They were known to be MAGA loyalists. They were known to be, in Serrano's case, for example, somebody who would walk around the blue cities, film videos, kind of really zeroing in on homelessness and what they saw as disorder to call out the leadership here in Washington state. So while they were clearly out of step with voters here, they were speaking to a frustration from the right and from MAGA with blue leadership of states and cities. Do you think that, right now we're seeing this phenomenon where possibly some elections with Republicans in our state could become like proving grounds for federal appointments instead of looking to really win over moderates in our state and in these districts? Would they be more like auditioning for federal roles with, say, a conservative Trump administration or in the future?
I think that maybe some of them could sort of play out that way. It's a little more complicated. I mean, and I think that, I think Pete Serrano wanted to be Attorney General of Washington State. I'm not saying that I don't think it would be accurate to say that he was just auditioning for a job in the Trump administration. I mean, nobody knew how that election was going to go, really. And Joe Kent, I remember, told me in 2022 when he was running that he might have gotten a job in the Trump administration after the 2020 election. So in other words, if Trump had won the 2020 election, which, by the way, at times Joe Kent said he really did, that Trump might have picked him back then for a position in some defense-related post. He never said what it was, but that rings true to me. So, that didn't happen. Joe Kent runs again. Again, I think Joe Kent thought he could win in the 3rd district. It didn't work out. He lost by even more. Again, in a district that's really notable that continued to vote for Donald Trump and has been, edged. It has a Republican advantage, but he's just been unable to win there against Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez.
Yeah. I just see like if you were really going to try to win, for example, the Attorney General position in Washington state, you probably wouldn't be, out in front on the most conservative issues. For example, with Serrano on high-capacity magazines challenging that ban in Washington or talking about January 6th as political prisoners. Like, that is really hyper-targeted to the MAGA base and the MAGA folks in Washington state, but not necessarily like a realistic bid to win a statewide office anymore in Washington, considering how far our politics have shifted left.
No, that's a good point. You're right that if you would expect somebody to maybe do a shift, you often see it in races, for example, where maybe in the primary you go one way, and then when you're up against the Democrat or whatever in the general election, you tilt a little bit and say, "Look, I'm a reasonable guy.
Yeah.
I'll listen to the people of this state." But in both cases, neither of them really did that too much. Joe Kent hasn't really ever, I think, moderated his positions either. In his last race, I guess he he did try to emphasize more economic issues and not just run on the red meat for the MAGA base about, January 6th or COVID vaccines. But for the large part, they didn't really try to say we're moderating, we're trying to move to the center.
They say in journalism, Jim, that it takes 3 instances to make a trend. And so we are looking at just 2 here. I don't know if you have any thoughts here. If you think that this is actually, are we looking at any more Republicans in Washington state that could be getting the nod from the Trump administration that you've heard about?
I haven't heard any specifics. You could imagine somebody like Jared Sessler, who ran against Dan Newhouse in the 4th Congressional District a couple times. And Jared is very much pro-MAGA, pro-Trump, unapologetic. I'm not sure what role he would slot into in the Trump administration. That's one figure.
Well, Jim Brunner, Seattle Times senior political reporter, thanks for humoring us with our theories about the trends of Washington state Republicans getting these big jobs. Thank you very much, Jim, for stopping by and chatting.
Thanks for having me again.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.